The day we buried Dempsey Mabry, the Savannah heat came early and stayed. I stood at the window of the house he built and watched the cars line up along the street below. Neighbors, business associates, church mothers, distant cousins, who hadn't called in years but found their way to the address without difficulty. That is what death does. It fills rooms that living never could. His chair was still in the corner, his reading glasses folded on the side table beside it. The particular smell of him, cedar and coffee, and something underneath that I never found a word for, still lived in the walls of that study like it had been painted in. 41 years in this house, and I had never once walked past that chair without knowing he was somewhere inside it. That morning, I could not look at it directly. My name is Alberta Mabry. I am 63 years old. I was married to Dempsey Mabry for 41 years, and I knew him better than any person alive. I say that not with sentiment. I say it because it matters. Because what I knew, and what I had watched, and what I had kept to myself for longer than most people keep anything, is the reason I am telling you this story at all. I dressed carefully that morning. Black wool, pearl earrings, low heels. Grief is real in this family, but it is not performed. I learned that from my mother, and I carried it the way she taught me. Upright, quiet, precise. You do not let people see the full measure of what you feel. Not because you are ashamed of it, because some rooms do not deserve it. The burial was at 11. By 1 o'clock, we were back at the house, and it was full of people and food and the particular low sound of a gathering that exists to fill silence with something bearable. I moved through it the way I have moved through every difficult room in my life, present, composed, watching. It was Freddie May who touched my arm first and said quietly that I should eat something. I told her I would. I didn't. It was 20 minutes into the reception when I saw it. Lester, my son, Dempsey's only child, crossed the hallway with purpose. Not the wandering movement of a grieving man. Purpose. He stopped beside Thaddeus Gadsden, our family attorney of 19 years, and leaned close. He did not look back at me. He did not need to. The message was in the not looking, in the angle of his shoulders, in the way his hand went briefly to Thaddeus's arm as if to establish something. A claim, a direction, a beginning. Tamika stood at Lester's shoulder. Her hand rested on his arm, and her eyes moved across the room until they found me. She held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away with the particular stillness of a woman who has already decided an outcome and is simply waiting for the world to confirm it. If you are watching this and you know that look, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Because what happened next took me a long time to understand. That evening, after the last car left and the house went quiet, I walked into Dempsey's study and placed my hand flat on his desk. The wood was cool. The room was still. And I remembered something he had said to me in the last good year before the illness, sitting in that same chair, in that same room, with the Savannah evening coming through the window. He said, "Alberta, I have taken care of everything." I had not asked what he meant. I had trusted him the way you trust someone whose judgment has never once failed you in 41 years. Standing there alone with my hand on his desk, I wished I had asked. Not because I doubted him, because my son had just made his first move, and I needed to know what was already waiting for him when he did. People always assumed Dempsey Mabry built his life alone. He was that kind of man. Large presence, deliberate voice, the type who walked into a room and rearranged it without touching anything. Savannah knew his name. His business contacts knew his handshake. His church knew his giving hand. What they did not know, what almost no one knew, was what happened before any of it was possible. I happened. Not in the way wives are credited. The supportive presence, the warm house, the good meal. I mean, functionally, structurally. Dempsey built things. I maintained everything that made the building possible. While he was in meetings, I was managing the relationships that kept those meetings productive. While he was closing deals, I was corresponding with the people whose goodwill made the next deal available. I kept financial summaries going back to the 3rd year of our marriage, correspondence logs, meeting notes from conversations I attended as his wife, and documented afterward as something closer to his silent partner. He never asked me to keep those records. I kept them because something in me understood, long before I could have explained it, that a woman in my position needed to know where everything was and what everything meant. That instinct did not come from fear. It came from clarity. 3 fireproof boxes, back of my closet, behind the winter coats. I have never thrown a single page away. Lester grew up in this house watching his father work and never once considered what I was doing while Dempsey worked. To him, the house ran itself. The relationships maintained themselves. The life they lived simply existed, the way air exists, present, assumed, never examined. He was not a cruel child about it. He simply never looked. And I never corrected him, because I have always known that people who require proof of a thing's value will never fully trust the answer once it's given. So I watched him instead. Watching has always taught me more than speaking. What I watched was a consistent orientation that hardened as he aged. Lester loved his father with the particular intensity of a son who has decided that one parent built the world and the other one simply lived in it. Every achievement Dempsey made confirmed it. Every decision I made quietly behind it went unregistered. By the time Lester was grown and married and standing in our living room asking his father about properties and accounts, I was furniture to him, present, unremarkable, easily moved. He was not the first person to make that mistake about me. He will not remember being warned. There is a part of my life I do not speak about in rooms where Dempsey's name carries weight. Years before this house, before the marriage, before any of what Savannah knows about me, there was Freddie May's house on the east side, and a version of myself I have carried quietly ever since. I am not ready to speak about that yet. What I will say is that carrying something for long enough teaches you how to move with the weight so naturally that no one can see the load. That skill has served me in ways I could not have anticipated when I first learned it. 3 days after the funeral, I was sorting through Dempsey's desk, not looking for anything specific, just doing what hands do when a mind needs occupation. I opened the top drawer. There was a single folded piece of paper. His handwriting. 4 words. She always knew more. No date, no context. Just 4 words in the hand of a man who spent 41 years watching me the way I watched everything else. I stood there for a long time. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket. I have not put it down since. The visits started becoming frequent about 4 months into Dempsey's illness. Before the diagnosis, Lester came to the house the way most grown children come: holidays, occasional Sundays, birthdays, when he remembered them. After the diagnosis, he came every week, sometimes twice. He always had a reason: checking on his father, wanting to help, being present the way a devoted son is present. That was the surface of it. Underneath was something I recognized the way you recognize a smell before you can name its source. The questions began gently. How was the Hargrove Street property doing? Whether Dempsey had spoken recently to the accountant, whether the investment accounts were being managed actively or just sitting. He framed everything as concern, practical, loving concern, from a son who simply wanted to ensure his father's affairs were in order. Dempsey answered what he chose to answer, and deflected the rest with the ease of a man who had been managing people's perceptions of his business for 40 years. I brought tea. I asked after their drive. I sat in my chair by the window and let them believe I was listening to something else. Tameka came to every visit. That was new. Before the illness, she came perhaps once a month, polite and contained, the kind of present that registers as absent. Now she sat in my living room with her hands folded and her eyes moving, across the shelves, the artwork, the furniture arrangement, the framed documents on the wall behind Dempsey's chair. Not admiring. Cataloging. I had seen that particular stillness before, in women who enter a space and immediately begin calculating what belongs to them and what simply hasn't been transferred yet. I gave her nothing to read in my face, nothing at all. The phone calls were what confirmed it. Lester would excuse himself, bathroom, fresh air, a call he had to take, and move to the back hallway or the far bedroom. He spoke quietly, but not quietly enough. I was not following him. I was simply a woman who had lived in that house for 41 years and knew exactly how sound moved through it. I heard enough. Account numbers referenced as questions. A name I didn't recognize spoken twice in the same sentence. The specific, careful tone of a man who is talking to someone he has already paid for advice. I said nothing. I went back to the living room and refilled Dempsey's water glass. What Lester never understood about me is that silence is not the same as ignorance. I have spent my entire adult life in rooms where people underestimated what I was absorbing. That habit, watching, recording, filing, was not something I developed inside this marriage. I brought it with me. It is as natural to me as breathing and twice as quiet. Near the end of the illness, on an evening when the house was still and Lester had not visited in several days, Dempsey called me to sit with him. I came and settled in the chair beside the bed and waited. He looked at me the way he looked at problems he had already solved, not working through something, confirming it. He said, "Alberta." I handled it. 3 words. I did not ask him to explain. I had learned long ago that Dempsey said exactly what he meant and nothing more, and that pressing him for elaboration on a closed matter was a waste of the precision he had just offered me. But I felt something shift in the room when he said it, something settle. What he had handled, I suspected, was large, built carefully, and constructed specifically to hold its ground against the kind of pressure that had been sitting in my living room every week for 4 months asking about square footage. I just didn't know yet how right I was. There are things a woman carries that never make it into the story people tell about her. I was 22 years old when I met him. I will not give him the weight of a name here because he has taken enough from me already, and I refuse to give him one more thing. What I will tell you is that he was persuasive before he was cruel. He knew how to make a woman feel chosen, specifically chosen, the way that makes you believe the choosing says something true about your worth. By the time the cruelty arrived, I had already reorganized my understanding of myself around his presence. That is how that particular kind of man works. He does not arrive cruel. He arrives charming and becomes cruel so gradually that you spend months wondering if the problem is your perception. I was pregnant at 23, alone in the way you can be alone while someone is standing right next to you. I called Freddie Mae on a Tuesday evening from a phone booth 3 blocks from the apartment I was too ashamed to invite her to. I told her 2 sentences. She did not ask me to repeat myself. She did not ask questions I would have struggled to answer. She arrived on Thursday with 2 bags and a decision already made, not for herself, for me. And she handled what needed handling the way Freddie Mae has always handled everything, with efficiency, without requiring gratitude in return, without making me beg for the help I needed. Yvette was born in the spring. Freddie Mae took her home to the East Side house and raised her with the same quiet competence she applied to everything. Freddie Mae never married, and Yvette carried her surname from the beginning. Most people simply assumed she was Freddie Mae's late-in-life child or a relative she had taken in. Nobody asked many questions. In those years, people were less curious than they pretend to remember. They accepted the story in front of them and moved on with their lives. By the time I met Dempsey, the arrangement had already existed for years and looked exactly like what everyone believed it was. I was present, visits, birthdays, the particular holidays where absence would have been too loud to explain. But I was not her mother in the way that word is supposed to mean. I was something adjacent, something that held her a little longer than the role I was. Performing required? Yvette was 19 when Freddie May told her the full truth. I was not in the room. I had agreed that Freddie May should be the one to tell her, because Freddie May had earned that right in ways I had not. Yvette received the information and went quiet in a way Freddie May described to me later as not angry, just rearranged. By 19, she had already built herself without my daily presence in it. The truth changed the architecture of her history, but not the foundation of who she had become. I carried this through 41 years of marriage. Through every holiday dinner where Freddie May sat across the table and we both knew the exact shape of what was moving silently between us. Through raising Lester in the same house where I had never once spoken Yvette's name to his father. Through every year that passed and made the telling harder simply by its passing. I do not stand here and tell you I made the right decision. I made the only decision I could see from where I was standing at 23 years old, with nothing but Freddie May and a telephone booth. What I will say is that I spent every year afterward accountable to it, to Freddie May's sacrifices, to Yvette's independence, to the specific silence inside my own chest that never fully resolved, no matter how much living I built on top of it. What changed was not the weight. What changed was me. At some point in the last years of Dempsey's good health, I made a decision. Not because he asked, not because I was afraid of being found out, because I had decided that a marriage strong enough to hold 40 years deserved to hold the truth as well. I needed to find out if I was right. I chose a Wednesday evening in October, not because the date meant anything. Because the house was quiet, Dempsey had eaten well, and something in me had decided that one more day of waiting was one more day of choosing the secret over the marriage. I was done choosing the secret. We were sitting in the back room, the one with the low lamp and the two chairs that had faced each other for 30 years. I waited until he set his book down. Then I told him. I did not perform it. There was no careful preamble, no orchestrated lead-in designed to soften the landing. I told him the truth in the order it happened. The man, the pregnancy, the phone call to Freddie May, Yvette's birth, the years of adjacent presence, the silence I had carried into our marriage and maintained every day since. I told him all of it in the same voice I use to discuss everything that matters. Flat, precise, accountable. Dempsey listened without moving. When I finished, he was quiet, in the specific way I had learned over 40 years, meant he was not shutting down. He was rearranging, taking something large and rebuilding his understanding of the space around it. I had seen that stillness before. I had never been the cause of it. He asked 2 questions. How long ago? And then, after a pause that lasted long enough for the room to fully settle around us, is Freddie May all right? I have thought about those 2 questions every day since. A man who has just learned his wife kept a child's secret for the entirety of their marriage, and his first 2 questions are a timestamp and the welfare of the sister who stepped in. That told me everything about Dempsey Mabry that 41 years of living beside him had already told me. I simply needed to hear it confirmed in a moment like that one. He stood up. He said my name once, quietly, without anger, and he went to the far room. I sat in that chair until the lamp was the only light left in the house. What I did not know that evening, what I would not piece together until much later, was that my confession to Dempsey was not the first time that information had moved through this family. Tamika had known for over a year. She had been investigating me, quietly, methodically, with the specific patience of a woman who understood that information is most useful when it is fully assembled before it is deployed. What began as ordinary family history research turned into something more deliberate. Property records connected Freddie May's address. Archived public documents filled in other pieces. Eventually, she located records tying Yvette's birth to a younger version of me carrying a different surname. Piece by piece, Tameka built a file, complete, sourced, organized, and 6 weeks before Dempsey's first hospitalization, she sat down with Lester and laid it open in front of him. Lester's response was not grief. It was not shock on my behalf or sorrow for a mother's old wound. It was the particular stillness of a man who has just been handed something he immediately understands the uses of. He did not call me. He did not come to the house. He filed it away the way Tameka had assembled it, carefully, for deployment at the right moment. The morning after my confession, I sat at the kitchen table while the sun came up over the Savannah rooftops, and I understood 2 things at the same time. My marriage had just entered the most difficult passage of its life. And somewhere across this city, my son was sitting with information he had been holding for months, information I had just independently confirmed to his father. And he was deciding, quietly and without urgency, exactly how to use it. I did not know yet what he had planned, but I knew my son. And I knew that look I had seen on Tameka's face at the reception. They had not come to grieve. They had come to collect. Lester never confronted me directly. That would have required a conversation. And conversations carry risk when the other person is paying attention. Instead, he went to Dempsey. The visits shifted in character about 2 weeks after my confession. I noticed it the way you notice a change in weather inside a house. Not dramatic, just different. Lester would arrive, greet me briefly in the kitchen, and move toward Dempsey's room with a purposefulness that had nothing to do with a son checking on a sick father. The door would close. The conversations lasted longer than they used to. When Lester emerged, his face carried the particular tightness of a man who had pressed on something and not gotten the response he expected. He was using Yvette as moral weight. I understood this without being in the room to hear it. He had framed my secret not as a family wound requiring care, but as evidence. Evidence of a character deficiency that should factor into decisions about the estate. He was not grieving a betrayal. He was building a filing, giving his position a moral architecture so that what was essentially a grab for money would have the appearance of principle. Dempsey said nothing to me about these conversations. He did not need to. I could read 41 years of that man's face across a room. What I could also read was Tameka. She came with Lester to every visit during this period, which I had already noted. But it was a Tuesday afternoon in February that confirmed what I had suspected about the level of organization behind what they were doing. Tameka had set her bag on the kitchen counter while I was at the sink. When I turned, she was retrieving something from it. A folded document, the kind that comes from a professional office. She set it on the counter briefly while she searched for something else. I did not move toward it. I did not need to. I read what was visible from where I stood. A letterhead, a name I did not recognize, and beneath it, in smaller type, Estate Challenge, Preliminary Assessment. She folded it away the moment she registered my eyes. Her expression did not change. She zipped her bag, smiled at something Lester said from the hallway, and walked out of the kitchen as if nothing had passed between us. She had already consulted an attorney. This was not a reaction to losing the estate. This was preparation. They had been building toward this before Dempsey was gone, possibly before he was even fully sick. What they did not know was that Dempsey had been documenting. I had noticed the notebook months before I understood what it was. Small, green, breast pocket. He wrote in it at the end of each day, briefly, deliberately, the way Dempsey did everything. I never asked what it contained. It was his, and I respected the boundary of it. But I remembered the last time Thaddeus Gadsden visited before Dempsey's final hospitalization. The two of them alone in the back room for nearly an hour. When Thaddeus left, he carried a folder. Dempsey looked lighter afterward. Not physically, in the way a man looks when something important has been placed in the right hands. I thought about that folder often in the weeks after the funeral. I thought about the notebook. I thought about what Dempsey knew, what he had written down, and what he had given Thaddeus to hold. And I thought about Tamika's folded document on my kitchen counter. I needed to understand the full architecture of what Dempsey had built. Not because I doubted him, because something was coming and I needed to know whether what he had constructed was built to hold the weight of it. The following morning, I called Thaddeus Gadsden's office and made an appointment. Thaddeus Gadsden's office sat on the second floor of a building on Bull Street, the kind of Savannah address that communicates competence without announcing it. I had been inside that office perhaps a dozen times over 19 years, signing documents, reviewing property matters, the ordinary legal business of a marriage that had accumulated enough assets to require regular professional attention. I had always come with Dempsey. This was the first time I came alone. His assistant showed me in without making me wait. That told me something before Thaddeus said a word. He was standing when I entered. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and settled into his own with the particular composure of a man who had been preparing for this specific conversation and was ready to have it. He folded his hands. He looked at me directly. He said, "Mrs. Mabry, I've been expecting you." I said, "I know." Dempsey had told him to expect me. That was the first thing Thaddeus confirmed, that in their final meeting before the last hospitalization, Dempsey had been explicit. "When Alberta comes, tell her what she needs to know." Those were his words, according to Thaddeus. Not if. When. Dempsey had never doubted I would find my way to that chair. Thaddeus told me what he was able to share. Dempsey had not structured a simple will. He had built a trust. The distinction matters because a trust is significantly harder to challenge than a will, operates outside the standard probate process, and can be constructed with specific protections that a basic will cannot carry. Dempsey had done this quietly over several months, during a window when his health had declined enough to signal urgency, but not enough to affect his legal competency. He had been certified by 2 independent physicians at the time of signing, not 1, 2, both of whom documented his full mental clarity in writing. Thaddeus told me this with the measured tone of a man describing the precision of a well-engineered structure. I asked him why 2 physicians. He said, "Because your husband anticipated that someone would question his mind. He removed that option before anyone could exercise it." I sat with that for a moment. The trust contained a no-contest clause. Thaddeus explained it plainly. Dempsey had instructed him to draft the provision as strongly as Georgia law allowed and to make clear consequences attached to any beneficiary who challenged the trust without sufficient grounds. The language had been reviewed repeatedly, integrated carefully into the trust, and structured to activate the moment a formal challenge was filed. Not threatened, filed. Lester would not know this until it was too late to undo. Thaddeus did not tell me the specific allocations. He said that information would be presented formally at the appropriate time. What he did tell me, and he said this with a deliberateness that made me understand it was the most important thing he would say in that room, was that my name appeared in the trust document in a capacity I had not expected. That Dempsey had written the specific language himself and asked Thaddeus to include it verbatim, that it had been included exactly as written. He also told me there was a sealed letter. It would be presented at the appropriate time, in the appropriate setting. He said nothing more about it. He did not need to. The way he said it, with the calm of a man who has read something and understood its full weight, told me the letter was not a formality. I thanked him. I stood. I shook his hand. I sat in my car outside that building for 20 minutes without starting the engine. Dempsey had seen everything I had seen, understood everything I had understood, and he had moved, quietly, methodically, completely, without saying a single word to me beyond 3. I handled it. I started the engine and drove home knowing exactly what he meant. The last real conversation we had was not about the estate. It was a Thursday afternoon in the final weeks, when the light came through the bedroom window at the angle that made everything in the room look older than it was. Dempsey was propped against the pillows. He had lost weight in a way that changed the geography of his face, sharper along the jaw, deeper around the eyes, but his voice had not changed. When he spoke, it still carried the same specific gravity it had always carried. That was the thing about Dempsey. The illness took from him progressively and methodically, and he gave up each thing without complaint. But the voice stayed until nearly the end. He asked me to sit. I sat. He said, "Alberta, what did this cost you? Not the estate, not the business, not any of the things that had occupied the conversations of the previous months. He meant the marriage, the life, the particular price of building something alongside a man the way I had built alongside him, present in every room, but credited in almost none of them. I told him it cost what it cost, and that I had paid it without resentment because I had known what I was building and I believed in it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A man who builds something and loves it doesn't leave it to someone who only wants to sell it." I did not ask him what he meant. I understood that he was speaking about Lester without using Lester's name, the way Dempsey always addressed the most painful things, at an angle, cleanly, without the drama of direct accusation. I filed it in the place where I keep the things he said that I knew I would need later. We sat together until the light changed. We did not fill the silence. After 41 years, silence between us had never needed filling. 3 days before his final hospitalization, Dempsey asked me to bring him the small green notebook from the top drawer of his study desk. I brought it without opening it. That boundary I had always kept. It was his, and I had never crossed it. He thanked me, and I left him with it. Through the partially open door, I could see him writing, slowly, deliberately, adding pages in the careful hand of a man who understood that what he was putting down needed to be exact. He wrote for nearly an hour. When Thaddeus arrived that same afternoon for what would be his final visit to the house, Dempsey received him alone. I brought them coffee and left the room without being asked. 40 minutes later, Thaddeus emerged carrying a manila folder. Inside it, I would understand this only later, were 2 things: the green notebook, its final entries complete, and a sealed envelope Dempsey had prepared separately, addressed in his own handwriting to the court. The envelope contained his letter, written in his hand. It drew from the notebook's recorded dates and specific incidents to document Lester's pressure campaign across the months of illness. It stated clearly Dempsey's full knowledge of Yvette's existence, his deliberate decisions regarding her inclusion in the trust, and his precise reasoning for every allocation he had made. It activated the no contest clause by name and directed the court to the trust language Thaddeus had drafted on his instruction. The notebook was the foundation. The letter was the instrument built on top of it. Thaddeus took the folder. He nodded to me in the hallway on his way out, a brief, professional acknowledgement that carried more weight than any words he could have offered. I did not see either document again after that afternoon. I did not know then, the next time I would see them, I would be sitting in a courtroom. They arrived on a Tuesday morning without calling. I heard the car pull into the driveway at 10:43. I know the exact time because I was at Dempsey's desk reviewing correspondence, and I noted it the way I note everything, automatically, precisely, without deciding to. I looked through the window and watched them come up the front walk together. Lester's stride had a quality I had not seen in it before. Not grief, not urgency, ownership. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on before they knocked. Tameka entered first, which told me everything about whose idea this visit was. She moved into the living room with the ease of someone who had already decided the space belonged to her and was simply tolerating the current arrangement. Lester followed and positioned himself in the center of the room. Not the chair, not the sofa, the center. in the way men stand when they want to occupy a space rather than exist in it. I offered coffee. They both declined. That was also deliberate. Accepting hospitality creates a social obligation, and they had not come to be obligated. I sat. I waited. Lester spoke with the composure of a man delivering news rather than making an argument. The estate, he said, would pass to him as the firstborn. That was the natural order of things, and he wanted me to understand it clearly so that the transition could happen without difficulty. I was welcome to remain in the house on a temporary basis while the necessary arrangements were made. He said temporary with the particular gentleness of a man who believes he is being generous. Then he said that any attempt on my part to pursue legal resistance would require certain information to become part of the public record. Information about my past, about choices I had made before this marriage that the people who respected the Mabry name did not currently know. He said it without raising his voice. He said it standing in the center of the living room his father built, in a house I had kept for 40 years, with the ease of a man who has spent so long confusing proximity to achievement with achievement itself that the distinction no longer occurs to him. He finished and looked at me with the patient expression of someone waiting for a response they have already anticipated. Tameka did not wait to be included. She spoke into the silence with a voice that carried no inflection at all. Flat, certain, final. That's right, baby. She doesn't deserve a cent. I looked at her. Then I looked at Lester. I took my time with both of them. I reached forward and set my coffee cup down on the saucer. No sound. I stood up. I told them, quietly, that any legal questions they had should be directed to Thaddeus Gadsden. They already had his number. I said nothing else. Lester's expression shifted, not to anger, which I might have respected, but to the specific satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed what he already believed. He read my composure as concession, my stillness as surrender. He nodded once, the way people nod when they believe a matter has been settled in their favor, and moved toward the door. Tameka followed without looking at me again. She had already filed me under resolved. I stood at the window and watched them back out of the driveway. Lester's posture behind the wheel was relaxed. He was already somewhere else in his mind, already past me. He had spent the morning in the house his father built, threatening a woman he had never once looked at carefully. He left without understanding that the most dangerous thing he did this morning was not what he said. It was believing that I had nothing left to say back. I drove to the east side the morning after Lester and Tameka left. Freddie May's house is the kind of house that has not changed in 40 years. Same porch boards, same screen door, same particular smell of cedar, and cooked things that hits you before you are fully inside. I have been arriving at and leaving this house for most of my adult life, with the specific discomfort of someone who knows exactly what the rooms hold and has never fully made peace with the weight of it. I pulled into the narrow driveway and sat for a moment before I got out. Freddie May opened the door before I knocked. She looked at me the way she has always looked at me. Directly, without the performance of welcome that people put on for company. I was not company. I was her sister. She stepped aside and I came in. We sat at the kitchen table. She poured coffee without asking. We did not begin with small talk because we have never needed it. The silence between us has always been a working silence, the kind that holds things rather than avoids them. She spoke first. She told me Yvette had received a formal notice as a named beneficiary of the Mabry Trust. She had not called me when it arrived. She had contacted an attorney of her own and instructed him to submit a written statement of non-participation. She would accept whatever the trust designated for her without appearing in court, without filing a challenge, without inserting herself into a proceeding she had not asked to be part of. Freddie May delivered this information the way she delivers everything, plainly, without editorial. The way you report weather to someone who needs to know what to wear. I nodded. I was not surprised. Yvette had built her life with her own hands, and she was not a woman who reached for things she had not earned through her own effort. That had come from Freddie May. I recognized it clearly and said nothing about it. Then Freddie May set her cup down and looked at me with the expression that means she is about to say something she has been holding for a specific moment. She told me that during Dempsey's illness, he called her. I went still. Dempsey had never called Freddie May directly in 41 years of marriage. They were cordial at family gatherings, respectful in the way of people who understand each other's importance to someone they both love. But he had never called her alone. Freddie May said he was brief and composed. He asked her one question. In all the years you have known your sister, has she ever, once, put herself ahead of the people she was responsible for? Freddie May told him no. She told him that I had made one devastating decision under circumstances that would have broken most women, and that every choice I had made in the 40 years since had been in service of someone other than myself. She told him that a woman does not change at the root, that what a person is made of shows up most clearly in what they do when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. Dempsey thanked her. The call ended. Freddie May picked her cup back up and looked out the kitchen window as if she had simply reported the weather after all. I sat with it for a long time, long enough that the coffee went cool and neither of us moved to refresh it. Dempsey had not forgiven me blindly. He had grieved privately, investigated quietly, and then chosen me with complete information, not from sentiment, from evidence. Something in my posture shifted in that kitchen chair. Something that had been carrying a particular bend for 20 years. The slight lean of a woman who has never been fully certain she deserved the ground she stood on. Straightened. Quietly. Completely. Without ceremony. The way Dempsey did everything. The process server arrived on a Tuesday morning at 9:17. I watched him come up the front walk from the window. Young man, dark jacket. Envelope held with the specific neutrality of someone who has learned not to make eye contact with the people he delivers things to. I opened the door before he reached the steps. He confirmed my name, handed me the envelope, and was back in his car before I had fully closed the door behind me. I took the envelope to Dempsey's desk. I sat down. I opened it carefully and read every page before I did anything else. The document was professionally constructed. 3 claims, each built with its own supporting argument. The first alleged undue influence, that I had manipulated a diminished man during his illness to restructure his estate in my favor. The second alleged mental incapacity at the time the trust was executed, arguing that Dempsey's illness had compromised his judgment in ways that should invalidate his decisions. The third was the character argument. Yvette's existence presented as documented evidence of a woman whose history of concealment and deception made her unfit to oversee or benefit from the Mabry estate. I read that third section twice, not because it surprised me, because I wanted to see exactly how they had framed it. The language was careful, precise, and organized in a way I recognized immediately. Tameka had structured this. Her attorney had written it, but her logic ran through every paragraph. The same methodical assembly I had seen in the way she researched, the way she moved, the way she had built her file on me before Lester ever knew what she was doing. It was a professional document. I gave it that. I called Thaddeus at 9:51. He answered on the second ring. I told him it had arrived. He said, "I know. They filed yesterday afternoon. I've already reviewed it." He was not surprised. He was not concerned. His voice carried the specific steadiness of a man standing on ground he helped pour. He told me that Dempsey had anticipated this filing with accuracy that still struck Thaddeus as remarkable. He had named each claim by type during their final meetings and had structured a specific defense against everyone. The incapacity claim was foreclosed entirely by the 2 physician certifications. Both doctors had documented Dempsey's full competency in writing at the time of signing. That argument would not survive its first examination. The character argument would be addressed by the letter. Then Thaddeus told me something that I had partially understood since our first meeting, but was now hearing in its complete and operative form. By filing this challenge, Lester had triggered the no contest provision. Thaddeus explained carefully that under the trust's language, any named beneficiary who formally challenged the trust risked forfeiting his designated share if the court ultimately upheld the provision. Dempsey had anticipated exactly this possibility. The language had been drafted deliberately, reviewed repeatedly, and embedded deep within the trust instrument. Lester did not know this yet. His attorney was not careless. Thaddeus made that clear. The man had reviewed the trust and identified the clause. He had simply concluded that the challenge's allegations, if proven, could overcome it. Dempsey had anticipated that calculation as well. Dempsey had told Thaddeus, "Make it easy to underestimate and difficult to escape." I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked Thaddeus directly, "Did I already know the outcome before I walked into that courtroom?" He paused, not with hesitation, but with the weight of a man choosing his words precisely. He said, "No lawyer should promise an outcome, Mrs. Mabry. But your husband prepared for this challenge more thoroughly than any client I've ever represented." Then he added, "The courtroom is not where the preparation happens. It's where everyone finally sees it." I understood the distinction completely. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat at Dempsey's desk and looked at the filing for another long moment. Then I placed it in the third fireproof box and closed the lid. I would be in that courtroom for every second of it. I did not sleep much the night before the hearing, not from nerves. Nerves belong to people who do not know what is coming and are bracing for the unknown. I knew exactly what was coming. What kept me awake was precision, the particular alertness of a woman running through every variable she could name, accounting for every person who would occupy that courtroom, leaving nothing unexamined before she walked through those doors. I sat in Dempsey's chair for the first time since he died. I had avoided it deliberately, not from sentiment exactly, but from the understanding that some things need to be earned before they are taken. I sat in it that evening because I needed to think from a position of stillness, and that chair has always been the stillest place in the house. I thought about Thaddeus. His preparation was complete. He had spent 19 years earning the trust Dempsey placed in him, and he had not wasted a single day of it. He would walk into that courtroom with the physician certifications, the trust document, and the sealed envelope. Everything sequenced, everything sourced, everything exactly where Dempsey had designed it to be. I thought about Lester's attorney, a competent man who had built a professional challenge on a foundation he believed was sound. He would present his arguments with confidence. What he did not fully appreciate was how thoroughly Dempsey had prepared for each one. I thought about Lester, standing in the center of my living room 3 weeks ago with the ease of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. I thought about what his face would do when it wasn't. I thought about Temeka, colder, more organized, the architectural mind behind everything they had built. She would sit beside Lester in that courtroom with the same flat composure she had carried into every room of my house. I was curious what that composure would look like when the letter was read aloud. I thought about Yvette, not in the courtroom, not in any room connected to this proceeding, living the life she built without assistance from anyone in that hearing room. I did not fault her absence. I respected it the way I respect all decisions made from clarity rather than fear. I thought about Freddie May, who had called that afternoon and offered to come. I told her to stay in her kitchen. She had already given everything this situation required of her. She did not argue. She simply said, "You call me when it's done." I told her I would. I thought about Dempsey, not with grief, with the specific gratitude that comes from understanding, fully and finally, that a person saw you clearly enough to protect you from something before you knew it was coming. He had done that quietly, without announcement, without requiring my awareness of it. That was the most Dempsey thing he had ever done. The house was completely still when Thaddeus called at 9:48. He told me without preamble that over the past 2 weeks, Lester and Temeka had made multiple inquiries to financial institutions where Dempsey held accounts. They had represented themselves as authorized parties seeking account information connected to the estate. One institution had flagged the contact and reported it directly to Thaddeus as the trust's legal representative. The institution had declined the request. That was not what concerned him. What concerned him was that the documentation submitted with the inquiry referenced trust provisions that had never been disclosed outside the formal estate process. Someone had been making assumptions about assets they did not control and authority they did not possess. He told me to document everything I knew independently. Dates, observations, conversations, anything I could confirm from my own records. I told him the 3 fireproof boxes had been ready since before the filing arrived. A pause. Then, "Of course they have." He told me to get some rest. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat in Dempsey's chair a little longer. Outside, Savannah had gone quiet, the way it goes quiet just before something shifts. That particular held-breath stillness that comes before morning. Tomorrow, Lester would walk into a courtroom to collect what he believed was already his. He had no idea what was already waiting for him inside it. The probate courtroom was smaller than people imagine when they think about the rooms where lives get decided. Lester and Temeka arrived 7 minutes before the session opened. I was already seated. I watched them come through the door, Lester in a dark suit, Temeka beside him in gray, both carrying the particular composure of people who have already written the ending and are simply here for the formality of the middle. Their attorney, a tall man named Garrett, who moved with the confidence of someone who wins regularly and expects today to be no different, settled his papers at the opposing table without looking at me. I looked at all of them. Then I faced forward. Judge Harlan Okafor entered at 9 on the mark. He was a compact, deliberate man with reading glasses he wore low on his nose and the specific patience of someone who has presided over enough family disputes to find very little surprising. He called the session to order without ceremony and nodded to Garrett to begin. Garrett presented the challenge cleanly. The undue influence argument first. That I had manipulated a weakened man during his final months to restructure an estate in my favor. Thaddeus responded by placing both physician certifications before the court. Judge Okafor reviewed them, set them aside with a single nod, and did not look up again. That argument was finished before it fully began. The incapacity argument followed and met the same certifications. Same nod. Same finality. Then Garrett moved to the character argument. He named Yvette. He presented her existence as documented evidence of a woman whose relationship with the truth was selective, and whose history of concealment disqualified her from the position the trust had named her to. Lester turned his head slightly in my direction during this section. Not fully, just enough to watch my face from the edge of his vision. I did not move. Thaddeus stood and noted for the record that Yvette Timothy, named as a trust beneficiary and duly notified of these proceedings, had submitted a written statement of non-participation through her own legal counsel and contested nothing. Judge Okafor confirmed receipt and made a notation without comment. Then Thaddeus placed the trust document before the court, and beside it, the sealed envelope. Judge Okafor picked up the envelope. He examined the exterior briefly, the handwriting, the notary seal, the date. He opened it with the letter opener on his desk and removed several pages of handwritten text. He began reading. The courtroom went completely still. He read for longer than anyone at the opposing table had prepared for. Long enough that Garrett shifted his weight once. Long enough that Lester uncrossed and recrossed his legs. Long enough that Temeka's composure, which had not moved all morning, developed something around the edges. A stillness that had stopped being confident and started being careful. Then the judge stopped. His eyes moved back to a paragraph he had already read. He read it a second time. A short sound escaped him. Not loud, not inappropriate. Genuine. He removed his glasses and looked briefly toward Thaddeus. Then he shook his head once and said quietly, "Oh, this is brilliant." The courtroom remained silent. Judge Okafor returned to the page and continued reading aloud. Dempsey's voice came into that courtroom through the judge's mouth. Precise, dated, specific. The visits, the questions about accounts, the phone calls from the back hallway. Every conversation Lester had believed was private, recorded in a green notebook by a dying man who missed nothing. Then came the passage that had stopped the judge. Dempsey had written that if a challenge was ever filed, the court should compare the allegations in that challenge against the observations recorded in the attached notebook. He then listed, by date, the exact categories of claims he believed would eventually be made and the reasons he expected them. Undue influence, mental incapacity, character attack through Alberta's past. One after another. Predicted months before the filing ever existed. Judge Okafor read each entry into the record. Dempsey's full knowledge of Yvette, his deliberate reasoning, every allocation explained in the language of a man who was not confused, not manipulated, not diminished, but entirely, devastatingly clear. And then, the no contest clause. Read aloud. Its trigger named. Its consequence stated without ambiguity. Judge Okafor set the letter down. For a moment he said nothing at all. Then he adjusted his glasses and looked toward Lester. Mr. Mabry appears to have anticipated this challenge with remarkable precision. Lester's face did not break all at once. It moved in stages. Confusion arrived first, then understanding, then something I do not have a name for. The expression of a man understanding that his father watched him, knew him completely, and still made every decision he made. Tamika did not look at Lester. She looked at the table. I watched my son's face through all of it. I did not look away. Dempsey had spoken. The room had heard him. There was nothing left for anyone else to say. The challenge was dismissed before noon. Judge Okafor ruled from the bench, no extended deliberation, no request for additional submissions. The trust document was valid. The physician certifications were unimpeachable. The no contest clause had been triggered by the filing itself, and its consequence was legally binding. Lester's designated share was forfeit. The challenge was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled in another form. Garrett gathered his papers with the careful movements of a man who has lost and is managing his expression. Lester sat for a moment after everyone else had begun moving. Just a moment, 3 or 4 seconds, before Tamika put her hand on his arm and he stood. He did not look at me on his way out. I sat with Thaddeus while the courtroom emptied around us. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was. That was the complete truth. I drove home alone. I made coffee. I sat at Dempsey's desk and let the morning settle around me the way mornings do after something large has finally finished moving. I did not feel triumph. I felt the specific quiet of a thing resolved, not the excitement of winning, but the stillness of having been right about something that mattered, and seeing it confirmed in the correct setting. That stillness lasted almost 3 months. Then, on a Thursday afternoon near the end of summer, Thaddeus called me at 2 in the afternoon. His voice carried a register I had not heard from him before, not alarm, but the particular alertness of a man who has just received information that has expanded the situation beyond its previous boundaries. He told me that a Savannah financial institution had contacted him as the trust's legal representative. Earlier that week, the institution's fraud department had flagged an authorization document submitted on Dempsey Mabry's behalf. The document directed a transfer of funds from a trust-adjacent investment account into an account registered in Lester's name. It carried Dempsey's signature. Dempsey had been dead for nearly 5 months. The fraud department had pulled the institution's signature records and compared them. The signature on the authorization did not match. The document also referenced a specific trust provision authorizing the transfer, a provision that did not exist anywhere in the trust instrument Thaddeus had drafted. That was not the only problem. The authorization packet included contact information for follow-up verification. When the institution attempted to verify the request through its standard procedures, the listed contact number routed to a prepaid mobile phone that had been activated less than 3 weeks earlier. Whoever constructed the authorization had worked from the estate documents submitted during the court proceedings. They had studied the language carefully enough to imitate its structure. They had not studied it carefully enough to know what it actually contained. Thaddeus told me the institution had conducted its own internal review before making contact. By the time he called me, the matter had already been escalated beyond the bank itself. He asked me about the fireproof boxes. I told him they had been ready since the morning after he first mentioned the institution inquiries. Every date I had noted. Every overheard exchange I had recorded in the weeks following the funeral. Every call I had been present for. Every visit I had observed. Every piece of information I had filed, in the habit of a woman who has kept records her entire adult life without requiring a reason beyond the understanding that precision is its own protection. He said he would send someone to collect them the following morning. I said, "They'll be on the front porch at 8. I made a second cup of coffee and carried it to the front porch. The Savannah evening had arrived the way it always arrives in that part of the city. Unhurried. Layered, the light going amber through the old trees on the street. Somewhere down the block, a screen door opened and closed. Birds moved through the oak branches overhead. The neighborhood sounded exactly as it always sounded. Nothing about it acknowledged what was coming. Thaddeus called again at 8:47. He told me quietly that the district attorney's office had opened a criminal inquiry into the fraudulent authorization submission. I thanked him. I ended the call. I sat with the evening for another moment, the birds, the amber light, the distant sound of the city going about its ordinary business around the edges of something that was no longer ordinary at all. Then I picked up my cup and went inside. Lester and Tamika were taken into custody on a Thursday morning on charges related to financial fraud and forgery. Thaddeus called to tell me. The district attorney's office had spent weeks assembling the matter. The bank records, the authorization documents, the telephone records connected to the verification contact information, the supporting materials collected from the institutions involved. By the time the arrests occurred, the question was no longer whether someone had attempted the transfer. The question was, who had participated in constructing it? I thanked him and we moved on to the next item of business. I have never been a woman who needed to watch a thing fall to know it has fallen. The meeting to formalize my role as the trust's primary administrator took place in Thaddeus's office on Bull Street, 8 days after the arrest. Same second floor. Same chair across from his desk. The difference was that this time the paperwork on the desk was not about what Dempsey had built in my absence. It was about what I was now authorized to carry forward in his name. The meeting was efficient. Documents reviewed, terms confirmed, signatures placed where signatures belonged. Thaddeus walked me through each instrument with the same precision he had brought to every exchange we had ever had. Thorough, unhurried, exactly as prepared as the situation required. When the last page was signed, he squared the folder and set it aside. He stood and extended his hand. I stood and took it. His grip was firm the way it always was. But when he spoke, his voice had moved slightly off its professional register, just slightly, just enough to be noticeable to a woman who pays attention to the distance between what people perform and what they mean. He said, "Mrs. Mabry, in 30 years of estate law, I have seen very few documents drafted with the precision and foresight of what your husband built. I want you to know that." I told him I knew. I thanked him and I meant every syllable of it. I drove to the east side from his office. Freddie May was in the kitchen when I arrived. She opened the door the way she always opens it, without ceremony, stepping aside to let me pass. We sat at the table. She poured coffee. The kitchen was exactly as it has always been. The same light through the same window, the same smell, the same particular silence that this room has held for as long as I have been arriving in it. But the silence was different. For the first time in more years than I can calculate with comfort, it carried no weight. Whatever had been suspended between us, the old debt, the long arrangement, the unspoken contract of two women who loved each other and had never fully put down what they owed, had been set on the table at last. Not resolved the way transactions resolve. Released the way things release when both people carrying them finally agree to let them rest. We had been sitting perhaps 20 minutes when we heard the knock. Freddie May looked at me. I looked at the door. Yvette came in from the afternoon light, tall, composed, with Freddie May's particular way of moving through a room as though she had already decided what it required of her before she entered it. She sat across from me at the table. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence held something specific, not discomfort, not avoidance, but the acknowledgement of two women who understand that some moments require a breath before they begin. She said, "I don't need anything from the trust. I want you to know that." I looked at her. The shape of her face, the set of her jaw, the specific self-possession of a woman who was built without a safety net, and learned to move as though the ground beneath her was always solid because she had decided it would be. She had built that herself. Nobody handed it to her. I said, "I know, but it's yours. Your father made sure of it." Yvette was quiet. Something moved through her expression. Not grief exactly, not relief exactly, but the particular shift of a person receiving information that rearranges something small but permanent inside them. She looked down once. Then she looked back at me and nodded. Once. Slowly. That was enough. It was exactly enough. We did not become something we had never been. We did not manufacture a warmth that the years had not produced. What we did was look at each other honestly across Freddie May's kitchen table. Two women shaped by the same absence, standing on opposite sides of a decision made 40 years ago, both still upright, both still whole. And acknowledge that the accounting between us was finally, completely, square. I drove back to the Mabry house in the late afternoon. I went to Dempsey's study. I stood at his desk and placed my hand flat on the surface, the way I had placed it the morning after the funeral. Same desk, same hand, same room. Everything else was different. I was not the woman who had stood there in grief and uncertainty, holding the weight of 3 words she had not thought to ask about until it was too late to ask. I was the woman those 3 words had been spoken to. The woman Dempsey had investigated quietly and chosen with complete information. The woman he had trusted not because the marriage was perfect, but because he knew, with the certainty of a man who kept records and paid attention, exactly who she was at the root. The Savannah evening came through the window the way it always comes, slow, amber, carrying the heat that never fully leaves this city even after the sun has gone. The old oaks on the street outside, the particular stillness of a neighborhood that moves at its own pace regardless of what has happened inside the houses along it. There are people in this city who expected Alberta Mabry to step back from this table quietly, to fold into her grief and make herself small and let the men who believed they owned everything proceed without interruption. I have never been that woman. I never had any intention of becoming her.